Welcome to the Black Writers Studio, a podcast presented by the Hurston Wright Foundation and hosted by Dr. Khadijah Ali-Coleman. The Black Writers Studio is dedicated to showcasing Black writers who are transforming the world today with their literary pen and creating a legacy for the culture. Soyica Diggs Colbert is the Idle Family Professor of African American Studies and Performing Arts at Georgetown University. Colbert is a winner of the Guggenheim Fellowship and the author of several books, including the award-winning Radical Vision, a biography of Lorraine Hansberry. The book is described as loving, lavishly detailed by the New York Times. She has also held fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities to support a residency at the Schomburg Center, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, Stanford University, Mellon Foundation, and the Robert W. Woodruff Library at Emory University. Colbert's writing has been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, Public Books, Metrograph, and American Theater. She has been interviewed on NPR and commented for the New York Times, USA Today, CNN, and the Washington Post. So it's so great to see you today because we most recently saw each other maybe a month ago. Wow, time flies. For an event with the organization Day 8, where we were talking about the theater and just the spaces and the efforts that are being made by activists to really push back against the lack of equity that exists in the theater world. So you are just this amazing scholar, artist, writer who is just at the forefront of many genres of writing. So I would love it, Dr. Colbert, if you could tell us, just give us a little insight in terms of your writerly journey. What led you to who you are now, what you do now?
So I'm grateful to be a part of this conversation. I think for most Black feminists, legacy plays a huge role in the way we think about our politics and our work. And so certainly that's the case for me. I'm speaking to you from Georgetown University, where I did my undergraduate work. And that was really a starting point for my life as a writer and a thinker and an artist. And I would pinpoint understanding myself as a writer and a thinker in an undergraduate course that I took my freshman year in college in the spring semester called Black Autobiography. It was taught by Dr. Angela Mitchell, who is still a friend and colleague and mentor. And we explored life writing, which has been a backbone of, the Black literary tradition. I remember reading Angela Davis's biography, which was edited by Toni Morrison, and being blown away and wondering how I could become a revolutionary. And so for me, there's really a full circle aspect to my journey because, I've recently written a biography. I'm currently doing some more life writing. And so I feel really blessed to be able to have this full circle moment of thinking about that early introduction to a form of writing that has been central to Black literary production, and now being able to participate in producing it.
That's fantastic. I know that in addition, I didn't know that you are an alum of Georgetown. I know that you, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're currently the Dean of Arts and Sciences.
So I was the interim Dean of Arts and Sciences, and now I'm the Vice President of Interdisciplinary Initiatives.
Oh, wow. And that is in addition to the work that you do with Shakespeare Theater in DC.
Yes.
So Can you tell us a little bit about that work?
So working with STC Shakespeare Theater has been a dream, and also this new position as Vice President of Interdisciplinary Initiatives has also been a real gift. And so I'll begin with STC because when Simon Godwin came on as the artistic director, this was pre-pandemic, pre-George Floyd, and the big, more explicit push in theater and really public push for diversifying theaters. he came on wanting to make the classics, which is what Shakespeare Theater produces, really more representative of how one would define classics in the 21st century. So he wanted to include more diverse voices, voices from different periods of time. And so he asked me to join in their work as a part of that effort. And I just want to tell the story that way because a lot of theaters have responded, rightfully so, to the call for more equity and inclusion post the 2020 uprisings. But STC already had that on its mind prior to that call, that national call. And so that's how I became involved with the theater. We had a wonderful production of James Baldwin's Amen Corner that the brilliant Whitney White directed. She's also affiliated with the theater. It ended right before the pandemic. The last few shows were canceled because the city shut down. And so, it just marks both an important production in the history of Baldwin's work, but also I think the direction that the theater had decided to take and is continuing on with my affiliation and the larger ethos of the organization.
Mm-hmm. You just, I don't even understand how you have time to do all of that. I know that I first met you last year during our Legacy Awards week, and you read a piece regarding Zora Neale Hurston, I believe, but I think I learned there also that you have been a former fellow, a Hurston Wright fellow, and that you yourself, you're a multi-genre writer, if I'm correct, right?
Right. So I have written, obviously, academic work. I'm a professor, but I've also written this biography of Hansberry. I've written pieces for the New York Times and the Washington Post. And so, mainstream print media. And so I have written in a number of genres. And then I'm also a dramaturg and recently have curated an exhibition at BAM about Hansberry's work and was a artistic producer for a radio play called Shadowland by the brilliant Erica Dickerson Dispenza, which is being produced right now this spring at the Public Theater in a full production. So everyone should see it. And so I've been really lucky to work in lots of different genres, but I will give a shout out to Hurston Wright because the workshop that I participated in, which was led by Imani Perry, was one of the turning points in my writerly journey. And so I really am grateful to the organization for providing that space for writers and also encourage folks who are looking for a space to refine their craft to look to Hurston Wright, and it's both weekend and week-long writing workshops.
See, I didn't even ask you to do that. I didn't even ask you to do that. I was asking. I appreciate you for doing that. But I was asking because as I prepared to have this conversation with you, I just know you from those cursory and interactions that we've had. But I'm telling you, it just has gone on, the breadth of your work, and it's so impressive. And I will admit to you, most recently, I read the piece that you wrote for, on the American theater, and particularly you speak to, this is probably one of the rare moments that I have during this podcast to speak to a writer about another writer, and someone who has such deep insight on someone who is really a literary icon. But you write about Lorraine Hansberry. I feel this is for the American theater. You talk about, we all know Lorraine Hansberry for Raisin in the Sun, but you talk about a production that folks may not be so familiar with that is now being staged. And I don't believe it was even staged, or maybe staged once during her short life. But it's called, I just had it, The Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window. And it ran for 101 performances and has only been sporadically revived over the years. Can you tell me a little bit about Lorraine Hansberry that fascinated you enough to really engage in this work that seems to have been continuous for you over a number of years?
Absolutely. So Lorraine Hansberry is the gift that keeps on giving. The scope of her work and her writing is vast, and it far exceeds the published work that most of the general public has access to. Mm-hmm. And even among the published work, there is a focus on A Raisin in the Sun, in part because it's a perfect play, and it's so brilliant. And so a lot of the energy gets consumed by Raisin. And as a result, most people pay less attention to the fact that she did have another play on Broadway that was produced right before she died, The Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window. It certainly was not critically acclaimed in the ways that Raisin was during its production. She also has a brilliant play that has been published, a screenplay called The Drinking Gourd, which if there are some producers out there who are looking for some content, they should look into this screenplay by Hansberry. But in terms of Sign, one of the reasons that the reception at the time was mixed, I think, is because the play primarily has white characters. Mm-hmm. It's set in the village during the 60s, and it seems to be a huge departure for fans of A Raisin in the Sun. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I try to talk about in the piece, and others have reflected on with this new production at BAM that is closing, I think, next week, is that the concerns of the play are similar and certainly in line with Hansberry's ongoing commitments, politics, and aesthetics. Mm-hmm. And so an example of this is Hansberry understood that revolution and transformation of society and the expansion of freedom for everyone would require that we attend to the daily ways that movements are structured. And so both in A Raisin in the Sun and in Sign, she sets the play in domestic space, which at the time was primarily women's space, because she wanted us to attend to how women then and now are central to freedom movements and how the daily activities that women engage in are central to getting us free. And so Hansberry had watched generations of activists before her who were women, the Sojourners for Truth and Justice, for example, her own mother, who had actively participated in freedom movements. And by actively participated, I mean raised money, protested, organized, all of the ways, the prototypical ways that we think about activism, and also created art and created future-oriented visions. Mm-hmm. So she had watched generations of women do this work and also noticed that they weren't centered, which for Hansberry actually isn't a problem, because similar to today, she thought we should have leaderless movements, that the movement should be about the mass movement and not about an individual leader. But in so doing, in her artistic work, she focused on those quotidian day-to-day activities of women and others that transform society. And so that's just one example of the way that this other play, Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window, is actually not a departure intellectually or politically, but it certainly does focus on a different subset and a different portion of life in America. The last thing I'll say about that, though, is, Hansberry was hanging out in the village in the 50s and 60s. And so the world she depicts is a world that she was a part of. And in Sign, she both showcases the possibilities of that world and her critique of liberal bohemianism. And so there's a speech that she gives at the end of her life where she asks white liberals to become radicals. And that thrust is at the heart of Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window. So she was talking to her friends who she was hanging out with in the village, who were not only white, but certainly a large number of them were white, and asking them how they could take part in what she saw as the future of Black freedom struggles.
I am so fascinated by that, because I had no idea about her role in the activism of that time until I began researching for a piece that I wrote about 10 years ago, centering Black women who are known as entertainers, but use their platform for social justice. And looking up information on Nina Simone, I learned about the relationship that she and Lorraine Hansberry had. And in fact, she was devastated with Lorraine's death, but spoke to Lorraine's pivotal role in really being the central figure in her friend group, rallying people together around these issues. And that's something that you definitely don't know. The mainstream media does not talk about when they talk about Lorraine Hansberry in general, as you said, was raised in the sun, but really as an artist. I know that you mentioned that she also did other things very similar to you. You have so many irons in the fire. She was very similar to you. Correct me if I'm wrong. She also was a columnist, or she did work where forward-facing work around some of these things that were central themes in her creative work. Can you talk a little bit about what some of that work looked like, some of the impact that it had on the social movements of that time?
Absolutely. So Hansberry moved to New York in 1950, and she started working for Paul Robeson's newspaper Freedom. And she was a columnist there, an editor. She served all parts of the paper. As I'm sure your listeners know, at the time, Robeson had been driven underground by the Red Scare, and his passport had been revoked. And so McCarthyism. And so Hansberry stepped in to have a public face for the writing and the work of the periodical at a time when Robeson was really embattled. And it's also useful to understand that this is a shifting point in McCarthyism. And so although Hansberry is as much a leftist and a radical as Robeson, her career doesn't suffer the same fate as his because the US politics are shifting slightly at this time. So Hansberry gets her tutelage, and it's a site for her to learn and to cultivate her writing working at Freedom. She published several short stories in the periodical under pseudonyms, which are available at her archive at the Schaumburg Center. And so she was writing in lots of different and publishing in different genres, although you may not be aware of that because some of her writing was published under pseudonyms. And so in terms of her trajectory, what's important here, and I talk about this some in my book, is that in the 50s, she's writing about Black freedom movements in Africa and Latin America. She's covering rent strikes. She's covering the Sojourners for Truth and Justice and women-led and organized freedom movements, and learning from all of these different spaces. So by the time we fast forward to the 60s, 1960, 61, 62, 63, when Hansberry is publicly raising money for, attending rallies for, advocating for CORE, SNCC, SCLC. She has already had all of these experiences in the 50s working with Freedom and other organizations that inform her politics and her worldview and her aesthetics, right? She's learning how to become a writer well before her hit play, A Raisin in the Sun in 1959. And so I can give a couple examples of the material ways that Hansberry is involved in what we would consider the classical phase of the civil rights movement. One is that she collaborates on a photo essay with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that is both a fundraiser, but also tells the story of what Hansberry calls the movement. And the name of the book is The Movement. And for Hansberry, the movement begins with slave insurrections, both in the US and throughout the diaspora. So in Haiti, Hansberry also writes a play about Toussaint Louverture, which again focuses her interest in a global movement for Black freedom. And so she talks about the movement beginning with slave insurrections and spanning all the way to her present time. And so she really understands the work that she's doing is connected in an intergenerational project. So that comes up in the collaboration with SNCC. And then there's also this very well-known moment where she's invited to a meeting with Bobby Kennedy via her other good dear friend, James Baldwin, who invites Harry Belafonte and Lena Horne and several others to speak to Bobby Kennedy about all of the unrest that's happening in the South. And, there are several narrations of this meeting. There's all these famous people that are there. But in every accounting, there seems to be consensus that in the heat of the discussion, Hansberry tells the Attorney General that instead of looking to the Negro intelligentsia for the answer to his problem, he should be listening to Jerome Smith, who was the one grassroots activist in the room, to see what he has to say about responding to the nation's race problem. And so for me, this is prototypical Hansberry, because she was very uncomfortable of all of her roles. So she was a writer, an activist, an intellectual. That's really important for me to name, because Black women are not often thought of as intellectuals, particularly in the 1950s. So I want to name that. But of all of her roles, the one that she was least comfortable with was being a spokesperson, because she didn't think there should be spokespeople. And so whenever she was hailed into that role, she would redirect the attention to the young people fighting on the streets, because that is where she thought the attention should be, the mass movement for freedom. And so, she is an activist in the sense of, as I said, protesting, creating art, speaking truth to power to the federal government, writing about it, all of the ways that we would imagine in our contemporary context. She was doing all of the work.
And even the fact that you opened with this connection to Paul Robeson, who really was being blacklisted and his career destroyed, and to know that she believed in his what do we call it now, a brand, or the what he was about at that time, to be one of his writers. And I love learning. I get such joy from learning all of the ways that he has impacted different people who were part of, there are our elders or our ancestors now. But to know, as I was learning about the connection between Nina Simone and Lorraine Hansberry, for that play that I was putting on, I also was learning about the connection between Lena Horne and Paul Robeson. And so for you to tell how all of these people are interconnected, and that they were so pivotal in roles outside of what we have grown to know about them as merely entertainers, but they were very pivotal in securing some of the forward movement that we have experienced as Black people in this country, is so significant. And I love that you're able to give us a little peek into these moments in her life. It's so fantastic. Can you tell us about your book? Tell folks about the book that you've already written, and if there's another book coming, and where folks can get it.
So I wrote a book called Radical Vision, a biography of Lorraine Hansberry, and it's available wherever wherever you buy your books. I encourage you to patronize independent booksellers, but anywhere you buy your books, it's available from Yale University Press. And the book was really trying to tell the story of Hansberry's ideas and situate her as a radical who's often thought of as a liberal, but she was not, but as a radical artist, intellectual, activist, and spokesperson, although I said she was uncomfortable with that role, and I think that's true. But really, the book is really trying to display her multiplicity, her networks, the community she was a part of. So I write in that book about Hansberry and the village scene, which is, as I said, inspires Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window. I write about her internationalism, which inspires her last play, which was not produced during her life, but was finished during her life, a play called Les Blancs, which is about an independence movement in Africa. And so I write about her early writing and her work with Freedom Magazine, and her relationship with Robeson, and her relationship with Du Bois and Alice Childress, and really trying to highlight one of the distinctive features of Hansberry's work is that she was a movement baby. And so she had parents who were actively involved in the civil rights movement. And as a child and a young adult, she ran in circles with an earlier generation of activist artists. Du Bois is our great example of the everything man. And so as is Robeson, as Shana Redmond's title of her book, depicts. And so having both of those figures as role models and as mentors informs what Hansberry does. And for me, it's useful to understand a woman also played a similar type of multiplicity, and to highlight that. And the last thing that I'll say is that Robeson, in my more recent research, I'm writing a book now that pays more attention to some of the figures that Hansberry is in conversation with. And so Robeson not only mentored Hansberry, but also mentored Harry Belafonte, through the American Negro Theater, as he did Sidney Poitier. And so there is this really strong connection intergenerationally that shapes the work of the civil rights movement generation artists. And I think we need to pay attention to that to fully apprehend the work that they were doing.
So well said. I can ask you questions that would go hours on end, because this is such fascinating work. It's right up my alley as a playwright. I find your work so compelling. Is there any way that folks can reach out to you on social media, or any platform that you have where you connect with folks that you'd like folks to know?
So I'm on Twitter. My name is at dr. For my first name, so at Dr. Soyica on Twitter, so folks can connect with me there. And I'm happy to exchange ideas. I wish we could talk more, because I'd love to hear more about your play. And I'm always curious. So yes, please reach out to me. I'm curious. As I said, I'm still writing about this era of work, and so I'm happy to exchange ideas with folks.
Thank you so much for spending time with me today in the Black Writers Studio, and I look forward to having more conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you.